This morning, I know many of you are here for a special occasion, and I know that the young couple on Monday, they're not going to pay attention to the sermon there or anything like that. You know, they'll be in another world. And so I thought to make use of the opportunity to share a few things here this morning. We talk here about marriage as a catalyst for change. You know, many years ago when I was in high school, I was over there in East Nicholas High School, which is just north of Sacramento on its way towards Yuba City. And my chemistry teacher was trying to describe, and it wasn't in my class because it would have been awesome if it was in my class, but he wanted to describe what a catalyst is, and he wanted to show it in chemistry class. So he took a dish full of some water in it, and he decided to put in pure sodium in there. And he put a little bit too much sodium there, and when you mix sodium with water, it actually explodes. Okay, so I always wish that I could get a whole bar of pure sodium and just throw it in the lake and see what happens, you know. But he blew it up, this whole Petri dish, so he didn't want to share that with us in our class like that. But catalyst is something that creates change. And marriage actually is something that creates change. You know, a lot of times people say, well, you know, you can't change anybody. You know, especially when you think of marriage, and they say, well, you know, you get what you get. That's it. A person doesn't change. In one sense, it is true. There are certain negative traits that don't change, and we'll kind of discuss that as we go along. But in reality, marriage is all about change. Yeah, so, you know, you've been going together now for, what is it, a year and a half, and now you've decided to get married. You're going to end up in a great change in life. Okay, and that's what we want to talk about a little bit this morning. Now, you know, you often hear men say this common phrase that you cannot understand women. Okay, it's impossible. You cannot understand women. Now, horses and dogs, yeah, you can understand them. But women and cats, they're unpredictable. You know, when you look at women, okay, so women are just too much trouble. Their emotions go all over the place. That's what happens with women. Now, men, on the other hand, women, you can often hear them saying what? Men, you can live with them, you can't live with them, and you can't live without them. They're kind of contradictory to each other, you see. This is what often you find between men and women. There's a struggle there that you're looking at in life. Something that complicates matter more than anything else is the media. Media creates a lot of complications. People watch movies, and it's amazing that the more they make movies, you find what? You find that women are the smart ones, men are dumb, they don't know anything. And what ends up, it actually starts molding society, and it becomes what you see. If you're spending your time watching that stuff, what happens? You will get that, okay? And it frustrates everyone in society. Now, there's a lot of snide remarks about that people have in regards to marriage. You hear a lot of those type of stories. Unfortunately, there's often an element of truth in all of that. You know, there are some issues. The misunderstandings, the lack of understanding is quite a challenge. And yet, in the middle of all of this, God has a plan. And now we come to our first Bible verse here. And I want you to stop and think. And guys, you know, I know quite a few single guys come. You know, weddings is a nice place to go to. You know, you go there and you want to enjoy the celebration and everything else. But here's something for y'all to think about. Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. The heart of her husband doth safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. She will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. Now, this is a challenge in today's society to find someone like that. And Hudson, you're very blessed. You're very blessed in this state. You know, Proverbs chapter 31 is a very amazing Bible verse. You know, when you think of marriage, it says here, God wants the home to be the happiest place on earth, the very symbol of the home in heaven. I mean, to think of, oh, I'm going home. You know, to find there what? Turmoil? Is that what you like to see? You know, is that the place you'd like to go to say, wow, I'm going to home for some turmoil today? No. You're looking for some happiness, some joy. And you have an opportunity, as we're going through the wedding celebration on Monday, you have the opportunity today to make something that is the happiest place on earth. For both of you, when you think of home, you think of the place that you want to be. I know we have to go out of home. Okay, I know that. We have to go to work. We have to do all these other things. Okay, but the thought of home to be the happiest place on earth. So for a few moments, I'd like us to think about the purpose of marriage. Oh, you like the photographs? I like them too. I really enjoy these photographs. You know, I'm really blessed to have had received some of them not long ago for something special, you see. So let's talk a little bit about the purpose of marriage. First of all, when we look at women, why did God create a woman? So here you have all this stuff that we talked about before. It says here, in reality, the Lord God said, what? It is not good that the man should be alone. I'll make him an helpmeet for him. So guys, I want you to think about this. It is not good for a man to be alone. Okay, now, getting married prematurely creates a lot of trouble. Okay, I understand that part. But you know, I find some guys tell me, oh, I'll never get married. And you know, when I find guys that say, I will never get married, those are the guys that get the worst type of marriages. I mean, over and over again. Why? They're not planning for it. They're putting it completely out of their mind. They're just talking about, oh, this is disaster. I don't want to have anything to do with it. And when you least expect it, they fall into something and they're trapped. And they spend the rest of their life in fulfilling their statement that I would never get married because women are like this. And the same thing with women, by the way. I've seen the reverse too. Okay, women, I'll never get married. Men are this, that, and the other. And they also end up getting married like that, in trouble. However, if you look at God's plan, that it is good, it's not good for a man to be alone. It means that it is good for a man to have a companion. If you start looking at it from that perspective, then you can start making plans. Just like when you start making plans for your occupation. You're making plans where to go to school and all these things. If you make proper plans, what's going to happen? You're going to have a good, decent life as a result. And it's the same thing with marriage. And God, who knows better than we do, that it is not good for a man to be alone. You know, Adam, he went there in the Garden of Eden after he was created, and he named all the animals. He took a look at every single one of these animals, and he noticed something. What did he notice? Even the animals were not alone. They were together, and he looks at himself and like, well, there's nobody here for me. What's going on here? You see, after the creation of Adam, every living creature was brought before him to receive its name. He saw that to each had been given a companion, but among them there was not found an help meet for him. Meet meaning suitable for him. Among all the creatures that God had made on the earth, there was not one equal to man. And see, that when you look at the original here, the very beginning, it was, Adam was looking for what? What was he looking for? What was he looking for? Yeah, he was looking for someone that was equal to him. He was not looking for someone below him. He wasn't looking for someone above him. He was looking for what? Someone that was his equal. And of course, we read the verse there that God said it's not good that a man should be alone. And then it says, man was not made to dwell in solitude. He was to be a social being. Solitude is not normal. You know, and this is what bothers me with all this COVID stuff. They're trying to separate people, trying to keep people away from each other. And what's happening as a result, you're having such a high amount of mental disorders that are happening in society today. And we don't know yet the consequences that this is going to be. And especially in some places where restrictions were so high. In some places, you are not allowed to go outside of your immediate family for 110 days in Victoria in Australia. 110 days. And they realized that some people were having a really hard time because they were living alone. And for 110 days to be what? Alone. And so they decided to make a social bubble. You can select only one person and you can meet with that one person for 110 days. They didn't know how long it was going to last. And we're going to see the consequences of this a little bit later on in the world. So here, God did not create us to be in solitude. And this is why when you want to punish somebody greatly in prison, what do? Solitary confinement. That's the biggest punishment you can give to somebody. And so here, obviously here, God made us to be a social being. Without companionship, listen to this. I want you to listen to this. Both of you and you can compare this. And some of you guys, you know, you're missing out on some things, you know. Okay, so here, without the companionship, notice here, the beautiful scenes and the delightful employments of Eden would have failed to yield perfect happiness. Can you imagine that? Here it is, you know, you're going to this beautiful Garden of Eden and you can't enjoy it. I remember when I was single, I go out there and I see this beautiful thing and it's not so beautiful unless you're with somebody. Isn't that the case? And especially if it's with somebody you love. And you all know this last year and a half, you know. We go out, you know, up there on the parkway, and next thing you know, Hudson and Eunice are showing up, okay? They're looking at the beautiful things, and they don't want to be by themselves to look at it. You know, you see them, they're always together, you know. And that's a reality. But this is what God has designed, isn't it? Listen to this, even communion with angels could not have satisfied his desire for sympathy and companionship. There was none of the same nature to what? To love and to be loved. That's the amazing thing. So even having an angel come visit you is not the same as husband and wife. Did you notice that? Even with something, think, oh, if an angel would be here, that'd be the wonderful thing. And yet, you have husband and wife together. Are you making the most of that? Or are you spending your time arguing and figuring out something else besides what God designed it to be? So, yeah, those of you thinking of a horse and a dog, sorry. Horse and a dog, don't cut it. Okay, does not make it. And you can see this young couple here so excited to tell you that. Okay, they're quite happy to be together most of the time, you see. This is the wonderful thing that God has for all of us. So, when we talk about help meet, okay, what does help meet mean? And just the definition here, it means one who helps. That's what it is. One who is helping the other. For example, you have in Psalms, God is their helper, and I'm not going to spend all my time reading every reference, so you all taking notes, you can take some notes there on it. Psalm 115, 9 through 11, you can read that, of how God is their helper. Patriarchs and Prophets, God himself gave Adam a companion. He provided and helped meet for him. In other words, what? A helper corresponding to him. one who was fitted to be his companion and who could be one with him in love and sympathy. Okay, so that's what helpmeet means. One who is corresponding to him. Okay, and when we're talking about corresponding, it does not mean the same. The same doesn't cut it either. You know, it has to be something a little bit differently here. God made from man a woman to be a companion and helpmeet for him, to be one with him, to cheer and encourage and bless him. Yeah, the guys are listening. Yeah, that's it. That's it. You know, that's what we're looking for. And he in turn, oh, we didn't read that part, eh? Yeah, and he in turn to be her strong helper. All who enter into matrimonial relation with a holy purpose, the husband to obtain the pure affections of a woman's heart, the wife to, that part there, yeah, the wife to soften and improve her husband's character and give it completeness, fulfill God's purpose for them. I want you to pay attention to this. What does that describe there to you? What does it describe? You know what it describes? Change. Yeah. It means changing the person. That's what it means. It's not meaning you stay who you are. It means there is a change. And what created that change? What was the thing that created that change? What is it? Marriage. So marriage is the catalyst for this change. It's a thing that starts the reaction, right? Okay, so the marriage, so Monday when you all exchange your wedding vows, that's the beginning. You probably already had some changes already, but nothing like it when you actually exchange the vows and start day by day living with each other. That creates this change. And it can be a wonderful experience in your life. So, in order to do this, what must happen? And this is a very difficult thing for some people to learn. Genesis 2 verse 24 says, therefore shall a man do what? He shall leave his father and his mother and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. What does marriage mean? The change is so drastic. In order to make that change proper, in order to make that change really to have its desired effect, there has to be a separation. Yeah, you had a separation from your parents the day you were born. That was a big traumatic thing. The baby comes in the world and starts what? Crying. Why? Change. We don't like change. You know, the drastic change. I don't like change, okay? So you get born, you start with that change, okay? But you're still with your mother and father, and now when you get married, guess what? It comes to the next stage of change. And that change to make, it says here, therefore shall a man leave father and mother. In order to what? To change, to cleave to his wife. But it means change. To have this change, there has to be separation. You can't do it in the environment of being together. I remember when I was a young Bible worker, I was visiting a place one time. And I was staying with a family for 2 weeks, and I was only 19 years old. And the husband and wife, they had serious issues, and they finally came to me and said, look, we need some advice. And I'm thinking, give advice, okay? You know, here I am, you know, single, and they're having a serious time in their family, you know? And, you know, just as a young kid, I told them what you need to do is, yeah, his mother has to move out. I said, your mom got to go. You can't have your mother here. They have little kids growing up already, and the mother's living in the house controlling everything. I said, you got to go. And the mother says, well, yeah, a lot of ministers told that us already. Well, okay. I'm just seconding the motions. Still took them several years for that to happen. And unfortunately, it did affect some of the kids in their later life when they finally made that change. And yeah, you need to take care of your parents, but first you need to do what? You need to what? first after you cleave. When you're cleaved and when you are now one, then you can take your parents in. The word cleave has some definitions here. These are the way it's translated in the King James Bible. Cleave 32 times, follow hard, overtake, stick, keep fast, together, abide, close, joined, pursued, and take. These are all the way it's defined there. 54 times used in the Old Testament. That's what it means to cleave. It means to actually be together. It means to be that close in this context here. You are not called, when we talk about cleaving, we're not talking here, you're not called to give up your identity. So neither you, Eunice, are to give up. You're not going to be somebody totally different. Yes, you're going to be different, but not someone. You're still going to have your individuality. And Hudson, you're going to have your individuality. That individuality is still important in a marriage. So you're not called to give up your identity. You each have an identity of your own. These may not always run in the very same channel. Did you notice that? This is the problem when you're talking about marriage. And a lot of times people are fearful of marriage because why? You do have your own identity, but there is also what? There's a merging. There's some things that you have to give up. Okay, and that's why, I talk to people, they talk about church committee meetings. They say, oh, those are terrible. We hate to go to church committee meetings. And usually the ones that hate it the most are the ones that want their own way all the time. They say, it's better when I make decisions by myself, which means what? I don't need anybody's advice. Okay, and that's a dangerous thing, actually. Committees are designed so that you can get together and what? Exchange ideas. Marriage is designed so you can what? Exchange ideas. Okay, so these may not always run in the very same channel. Okay, and that's a good thing. And yet there may be that blending that God required. So you're going in a different channel, but there's still that blending. The wife united with the husband in the fear of God is to be a strength and power in the church. God can make them thus. Can you look at this here? The wife united with the husband. Okay, so who's going to be the strength and power in the church? It's the couple together. It's not just one or the other. And too many times we're looking at it one and the other. It's actually both of them pulling together. And sometimes, when I look at church and the church environment, we want to separate. Oh, you do this, you do that. This separation. And yet here it's pulling together that becomes a greater power. Marked diversities of disposition and character frequently exist in the same family. Why? Why do you have differences of character? Why do you have differences of disposition? In the same family, husband and wife, different dispositions. Why? For it is in the order of God that persons of varied temperaments should associate together. When you selecting a committee, just going to separately here, talking, we're here learning lessons from marriage in the church, okay? When you have a committee, what do you want? The same type of people in one committee? That's called disaster. That's serious disaster. I remember when I was first elected president of this field here, we were actually we were right there in that little, where's it, back here, that little room there. And, they decided since we don't need a lot of change, so we're going to put only 3 members in the committee. I looked at the other 2. I thought, those guys don't speak up many times. I said, this is disaster. So I asked we need to add 2 more. I added 2 spokesmen, people that don't be quiet, okay? Why? We needed some balance there. We needed something there in order so that I figured if I can convince these 2 guys, it's a good plan. If I can't convince them, we're going to have other trouble elsewhere. And so here, it's the same thing in marriage. God puts people that are different, and both of you are very different in certain ways, okay? And that's the good thing. And God designed it. It is God's order that there is that difference. Why? So that there is change. You see, that's what God wants here. By this means, mutual consideration and forbearance will be cultivated, prejudices will be softened, and rough points of character smoothed. Harmony may be secured, and the blending of the very temperaments may be a benefit to each other. In other words, if you look at this, actually, in reality, marriage is preparing you for a place called heaven. Yeah, your characters need to change. So how does that character change? It changes by getting them where? Preparing them for another world. Yeah, prejudices softened. Okay? Rough points of character smooth over. Harmony secure. This is a wonderful thought here. You know, this is what it's all about. So, when you look at those differences, they actually work to do what? To improve your character. And not only your character, but what else? Your abilities. Yeah, your abilities actually improve. And this is why when you're, even in work environment, you find that people who are married, they take on major responsibilities. And why is that? Because they've been improving their character as well as their abilities. And that's what we're looking forward to here. So, when we look at cleaving together, Mark chapter 10, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. So that they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God had joined together, let not man put asunder. So when God puts you together, you're no longer two. You have one goal, one plan. And I find sometimes, I find some married couples, they're in two different directions. All their goals, their plans are separate, and they make good money, and they're poor. I don't know if you noticed that. They make good money, but they never have anything. Why? They never pool their resources together. And so they're always struggling, and they're actually losing. To where, when you look at this, you are no longer twain. You are still two. Okay, but you're no longer two. You are now one. Why one? It says here in Ecclesiastes, two are better than one. So you hear this, single guys and girls? Two are better than one. Why? Because they have good reward for their labor. For if they fall, the one will lift up his fellow, but woe to him that is alone when he falleth, for he had not another to help him up. Yeah, that's what happens. Sometimes you fall. Sometimes you get discouraged. When one gets discouraged, the other one's not discouraged. I've noticed this a lot in couples. One is discouraged, the other one's bubbling up. Next time you go there, the other one's discouraged, but the other one's bubbling up, okay? And it's wonderful that they're together. You see, and what's even more wonderful, what's more wonderful than two? That's right. Again, if two lie together, then they have heat, but how can one be warm alone? And if one prevail against him, two shall withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. And that threefold cord is not another person, by the way. Not your parents, okay? No. Not your parents. It's not your friends. It's not anybody else. It's Jesus Christ. Amen. You get anybody else in that cord, in that you have to come to the point where even sometimes you have to say, sorry, this is our sacred circle. It's time for you to get out. Okay? And the hardest thing is if some parents don't want to let go, that's the time to tell them sometimes, look, this is my little sacred circle. And you need to be outside that sacred circle. Yeah, you can give advice. And as pastors, I see sometimes pastors getting too involved. And you have to be able to get there with them and tell them, okay, here's some advice. Now you go figure it out. You got to go make those decisions yourself. You can't be involved with it. Okay? That third cord is not the pastor, it's not the church, it's not your parents, it's not your siblings, it's not your friends, it's Jesus Christ. And when you have that relationship with Jesus Christ, it'll change everything in your life. So marriage does not lessen their usefulness, but what? Strengthen strengthen it. That's what. So both in your personal lives, in your church life, even in church life. I like it when young people get married. Why? Because we can use them more in the church. Yeah, it strengthens their usefulness in the church. Yeah, that's true. Okay. At the same time, you got to look at this too. So Hudson, you got to look at this part here really carefully here. No one, no one can effectually ruin a woman's happiness and usefulness and make life a heart-sickening burden as her own husband. You see that? That's a strong statement there. And Eunice, you're not left out. And no one can do 100 part as much to chill the hopes and aspirations of a man, to paralyze his energies and ruin his influence and prospects as his own wife. So you got to think seriously about marriage. So marriage is something serious. Now, of course, some people are so terrified of all of this, they don't want to take any risks, so they do nothing. And that's what a lot of people do in life. They don't take any risk at all. And their life is not a life, okay? Life means risk. Okay, it is from the marriage hour that many men and women date their success or failure in this life. And not only this life, but what else? And their hopes of the future life. So when you look back, if we have time 10 years from now, we will have time 10 years from now, one way or the other. So if we're in another world, you can also look back 10 years from now. If you look back to this day, you're going to see that this day has changed a lot for you. So it's 2 more days, but yeah, I understand that. But it's going to make a big difference. Your success or failure in life, you're going to be able to mark and say, well, that was the day. That's the day when everything changed. And so this is why it's so important for you to have that third cord, to make sure that Christ is woven in, not just in a little bit, but in a completeness of your life. So let's just take a few moments to understand how do we accomplish God's original purpose for marriage. Let's take a look at that. First of all, you got to understand one thing, and that's Amos 3 verse 3, can two walk together except they be agreed? And this is where it's so important for couples to take time to actually ask themselves questions on what they agree on, what they disagree on. Now, it's true there's a lot of things that you may have differences, and we talked about that. That's okay to have certain differences, but not complete different direction in life. Okay? So you need to be able to talk about that. And that's why it's so important to have premarital counseling, to sit down and talk about these things. I know sometimes people, they ask me, what should I read? And if they're already engaged and everything else, practically at that point it's too late for them to read anything because they're not going to pay attention to it. And this is why before you get involved with somebody, that's the time to read a lot of things. So Messages to the Young People has a good section in there. Adventist Home has a good section. I think Ministry of Healing has a really good section on it. Those are some things that it's really good for you to read about. And then talk about it, to get somebody that you trust, that you can counsel with, to discuss some of these things. And then as you're going together, as you're evaluating each other, you have to agree. And one of the things that you have to agree upon is your relationship to Jesus Christ. That's something that sometimes people assume. Okay, you grew up in the church, therefore you have the same kind of conclusions. Well, that's not always true. Sometimes people grew up in the church and they have a totally different perspective in life. Sometimes they grew up in an environment and they're just waiting till they get old enough. I remember one young lady, she got married. I think she was 18 when she got married. And I tell you what, she was a whole different person at 21. And she was eager to get out of the constraints of everything that she's ever had. And it was disaster on the marriage. Why? Because she just hadn't had that time to think about this thing. She was so busy in her life. In her case, she was so busy taking care of her other siblings that she had no time for herself. And as she grew older, and in a married environment, she was on her own and suddenly she went wild. And these are things that's so important to talk about because can two walk together except they be agreed? And if you're not agreed in that relationship, then marriage is not going to change it. So sometimes you find people who say, oh, this person's having a difficult time in their spiritual life. They should marry a strong person spiritually. That becomes disaster again, because what happens? You're relying upon someone else for your salvation. And that's where you need to get your spiritual life together first. But once you're married, what then? Well then, how shall they blend? How do you blend? How does a couple blend? Well, first of all, you need to counsel together. In other words, talk. So many times, both in church capacity and in marriages, people don't talk. They assume. Okay, in church what happens? You assume something, and what happens? A big mountain, suddenly, we have a big problem in the church. We got to solve this issue, and you find out they haven't even talked yet. Okay, just go talk. Talk to this person. Go talk to this individual. And most of the time, I find in talking, you find solutions, if you want solutions. If you're doing your duty, I'm coming here to talk to you. I checked it off the list. I've talked. Okay, that's not going to help you. So if you, as a couple, decide that, here's our list, we need to talk together, I've checked it off, we're done, that's not going to work. So counsel together. If there are any differences of opinion, yet we would say counsel together, and the blessing of God will come right into the heart. Oftentimes I find that when you're praying about it, you're counseling together, sometimes the Lord has a marvelous way of speaking to you in worship. When you have worship together, suddenly you read something and it comes right to your heart, and that's God speaking to you. Now Satan, of course, tries to create differences. Satan is ever ready to take advantage when any matter of variance arises. And by moving upon the objectionable hereditary traits of character in husband or wife, he will try to cause the alienation of those who have united their interests in the solemn covenant before God. So Satan's looking to try to find ways to create division and create variances. In the marriage vows, they have promised to be as one. That's what you've promised. The wife covenanting to love and obey her husband, the husband promising to love and cherish his wife. That's what you make in the vow that you are going to make. If the law of God is obeyed, the demon of strife will be kept out of the family. Nothing worse than strife. And no separation of interest will take place. No alienation of affections will be permitted. Now, so what does the word permitted mean? Allowed. So what is not allowed? No alienation. That means it's a choice. So just to let just understand something. Alienation, separation of interest is a decision. It is a choice. And this is why even when somebody tells me, well, I don't love her anymore, or she says, I don't love him anymore. And my first question is, when did you decide that? So what do you mean? Well, obviously you decided that one day. They said, no, it just happened. I don't love her anymore. I said, yeah, but you loved her, the first time you loved her is when you saw her picture somewhere on Instagram. Okay, and you're going to tell me you loved her and you didn't even know her yet? You saw her somewhere on a Facebook page or something? I've talked to people, yeah, that's how they loved. Oh, I like that girl. And they go chase after that girl. Where did they find it? They found it there. Okay, well, that was a decision. Well, you can make that same decision today. Today, when you're having difficulties, you can make that same decision. You see, so in other words, you don't permit that. You decide this is not allowed. And so that's going to be the most challenging things. And both of you are very mild in temperament. Yes, that's true. But you're going to find differences. It's going to be amazing how you find differences. Okay? And it's at that point that you have to decide, no, I'm not going to allow that. Okay, that's what you have. That's a choice that you need to actually make. It's interesting here. It says, your spirit is wrong when you take a position, you do not weigh the matter well and consider what must be the effect of your maintaining your views and in an independent manner weaving them into your prayers and conversation when you know that your wife does not hold the same views that you do. Yeah, I've been places, you hear the person leading out in worship and they start reading and they start praying, Lord, and they're praying that my wife will see this or my husband will see that. I've seen it both ways, actually. You know, and that's when visitors are present. I mean, I was there. I heard it. Okay, I heard that prayer. This is their prayer. This is their conclusion. And you think God's going to listen to that? Even if you're right, do you think God's going to listen to that type of an attitude? There's a lot of things that we do, both in families and in the church, that you may be right, but you're totally wrong. Yeah, you're totally wrong in the way that you do it. And this is why we need to examine our hearts to make sure that we're doing things, not just the right things, but in the right way. It's really important there. Instead of respecting the feelings of your wife, and again, we're applying this both ways, okay? So, you know, it's not just one direction, but we're just reading the one aspect. Instead of respecting the feelings of your wife and kindly avoiding, as a gentleman would, those subjects upon which you know you differ, you have been forward to dwell upon objectionable points and have manifested a persistency in expressing your views regardless of any around you. And this also goes with your children too. I mean, sometimes, you know, the kids, you know, they turn 13, 14 years old and you like think, wow, where did this come from? You know, and if we do the same, you know, do you avoid some of those differences? Or every time you meet each other, you want to have a clash? You want to win. Well, you may win, but what a cost. What cost are you prepared to pay for that type of a win? And it begins with husband and wife. It begins with both of you before you have any kids, before you have anybody else. It starts with that. And as a gentleman, are we gentlemen Christians? What about in our viewpoints of different things? You know, of what we believe. You may believe the right thing, but are you a gentleman about it? Yeah, sometimes avoiding certain issues. These are questions that we have to analyze for ourselves. You see, often it is our own attitude. This is attitude. The atmosphere that surrounds ourselves which determines what will be revealed in us, to us in another. What atmosphere are you creating? So you're both having an opportunity. You have, you know, this wedding coming up, so you're quite busy thinking about that. You have this honeymoon coming up where you're going to spend some time, hopefully a good time together, you know, and then you come to reality. The question is, what is going to be your reality? Are you going to keep the honeymoon experience, the atmosphere around you for the rest of your life, or is it going to end? Those are the questions you got to solve. And these are decisions that you're making today here. You see. Now, the most wonderful thing here, you talk about marriage, you know, and it's not just marriage, but it also a principle affects in church relationship. It says here, likewise, ye younger, submit yourselves unto the elder. And it doesn't stop there. It's an interesting thing. Yea, all of you be what? Subject one to another. This is an amazing statement here. And be clothed with what? To be subject one to another means what? To be clothed with what? Humility. Being willing to be subject one to another. And what's the basis of subjection? Has to be, husbands, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. Are we prepared to do that? That's what marriage is about. That's what marriage leads you to. You know, you come to the point of surrendering, but that surrender comes when you love. When you love, you can do anything, practically. Even defects, you know, it's amazing. Somebody's in love and all of a sudden you try to counsel them, you know, there's this defect going on here in your potential partner, and you sit there, oh, it's fine, it'll all work out nicely. Why? Because you're in this mad thing of love. And then when you get upset with each other, what happens? The smallest thing, nothing like that point, and then you irritate you. Why? Love. That's why love is a plant that needs to be cultivated. Nevertheless, let every one of you in particular so love his wife even as himself, and the wife see that she reverence her husband. The two things are going interchangeable back over and over again. Yeah, but time strips marriage of romance, with which imagination is clothed, and then the thought finds entrance into the mind through Satan's suggestion, we do not love each other as we supposed. That's the most challenging thing in marriage, when you come to the point when time goes by and you decide, wow, we don't love each other as we supposed. Well, you know what to do with that. It's very clear here. You know, you can't rationalize it at that point. Once you're married, once you've made that vow, what do you need to do? It's very simple. What does it say here? Expel that thought from your mind. That's how you do. That's how you deal with it. There's no other way to do it. You just expel it from the mind. Do not linger over it. Let each, forgetful of self, refuse to entertain the idea that Satan would be glad to have you cherish. Satan. So in other words, this statement here, once you're married, we do not love each other, comes from who? Do you recognize that? Do you recognize in marriage, okay, that was Satan's instigation? Or are you going to play around with it for a little while? Let's see what happens with it. Well, go play with a snake, the bad ones. I mean, I know I play with snakes, but those are nice snakes. Okay, I'm talking about the poisonous snakes. I mean, you're going to get bit. And everyone who works with snakes, they get bit like that. You see, and if you're not prepared for that, it's going to kill you. You see. So, not just stop thinking about it. Let husband and wife talk things over together. Renew the early attentions to each other. Acknowledge your faults to each other. Now, it's interesting here. You know, when people tell me, well, how do we get that back in our life? Well, just do what you did when you were going together, when you were courting. When you said, I like that girl, or the girl says, I like that guy, you know, what did you do? There are things that you actually did. You actively pursued. Yeah, you did things. You went out together. You wanted to spend time together. Well, that's how you do it in marriage too. There's no different. Nothing changes. It's the same principle over and over again. Okay? And then it says, acknowledge your faults to each other. Now, let's look at that part. But in this work, be very careful that the husband does not take it upon himself to confess his wife's faults, or the wife her husband's faults. You know, we're so easy to confess. When it says confess your faults one to another, and I'm here to tell you your faults. Well, that's not what it says here. You know, that's a lot of times marital counseling, and I see people sit there and they say, okay, tell openly what you think about the other person. That's not what it says. You want trouble, just start doing that. Just start exposing the faults of the other person. And especially, it's bad enough when you're doing it just with yourself at home. Imagine when you do that in a public environment. And I've seen couples confess the faults of their spouse in a church environment. And they say, oh, you got to be honest with each other. Well, yeah, go home and, you know, go be honest with yourself. Examine your heart, and you'll be surprised to see what defects you have, and that will be much more beneficial. Through difficulties, perplexities, and discouragement may arise, though they may arise, let neither husband nor wife harbor the thought that their union is a mistake or disappointment. Now, this is the biggest thing. Oh, you know, I should have married someone else. Well, you know, you start going down that path. You know, the fact is that not everyone, you know, people are not who you think they are. You know, even both of you now, you think you know each other? Just wait till the end of next week and tell me that. You know, seriously, you're going to find out things about each other you can't find in any other way. And when you sit there and say, oh, that other person must have been better, guess what? You don't know them. You think you know them. And a lot of people in this world, they encourage you, okay, if it's bad, go get the other person. Leave this one. And what happens? They're 10 times worse than this one. And they go down a spiral. Why? Because you don't know them. And this is why don't mess with it. Never husband, neither husband nor wife, harbor the thought that their union is a mistake or a disappointment. Determine to be what? All that is possible to be to each other. In other words, Hudson, it does not say, you know, you got to tell Eunice, you got to determine to be all that is possible. No, you have to decide, I need to be all that is possible for me. Eunice, the same thing for you. You need to decide, I need to be at this. And then what you're going to find? You're going to find that joy and happiness. Continue the early attentions. In every way, encourage each other in fighting the battles of life. Study to advance the happiness of each other. And, you know, especially when kids come involved, you know, you separate from each other to a degree. You know, you got to find time just for each other. You still got to find that time to spend with each other. Let there be mutual love, mutual forbearance. Then marriage, instead of being the end of love, will be, as it were, the very beginning of love. The warmth of true friendship, the love that binds heart to heart, is a foretaste of the joys of heaven. You got to understand this principle. And, we often use this for money. It's not just money. It is more blessed to give than to receive. In marriage, guess what? It's the act of giving. Doing something for someone else. That is more blessed than to receive. And somehow in society you think, I've seen so many marriages, it's time to eat and the husband sits there at the table waiting for his dinner to be served. Well, I'm sorry, it's more, how are you going to enjoy the meal more? Get up and help it get ready. Go do something. Just sitting down is not going to, it's more blessed to give. In many ways, when you're thinking of how to give, that's how you end up receiving the blessings that God has for it. And of course, the consciousness of being appreciated is a wonderful stimulus and satisfaction. Sympathy and respect encourage the striving after excellence, and love itself increases as it stimulates to nobler aims. So, consciousness of being appreciated. Do you continue to appreciate each other? But remember that happiness will not be found in shutting yourselves up to yourselves, satisfied to pour out all your affections upon each other. So just another thought here, and we talk here about happiness, but that happiness is when you give yourself to others as well as a couple. And so being actively involved in the church, doing things for other people, that's when you find even more happiness than you have. So just being exclusive to yourself, that's not where happiness is. Seize upon every opportunity for contributing to the happiness of those around you. Remember that true joy can only be found in unselfish service. So you want real happiness. Yeah, you need your honeymoon. You need a bit of time together, The first year, yeah, I understand the first year, spending time more to each other. But you got to, even during that first year, to spend a little bit of time for other people. And then after that, your happiness is found in both of you giving. The more you give, the more happiness you'll find. Just keep in mind that the wife of a minister of the gospel, and this is applying to everybody, can be either a most successful helper and a great blessing to her husband or a hindrance to him in his work. It depends very much on the wife whether a minister will rise from day to day in his sphere of usefulness or whether he will sink to the ordinary level. And this is on everything in life. This applies everywhere. Who your husband is going to be is determined on who you are. Who your wife is going to be depends on what? On who you are, what you are doing in that direction. There's a few more things, but I'm going to skip it over. I'm going to go right down to the conclusion here. If we look at the marital relationship, when the divine principles are recognized and obeyed in this relation, marriage is a blessing. It guards the purity and happiness of the race. It provides for man's social needs. It elevates the physical, the intellectual, and the moral nature. Those are some of you who tell me, I'm going to be single. I want you to look at this. Marriage, when divine principles are followed, what happens? It provides socially, and then what? Elevates your physical, elevates your intellectual. Can you imagine? You get smarter. Well, that's what it is. Isn't that what it says? Does marriage, when followed by God's plan, does it improve your intellectual abilities? That's what it says, and also your moral nature. You don't see that in the world today. Now, the world has been accustomed to marriages being blah. Okay? So I'm going to tell you a story about some dogs. Yeah. Let me tell you, they took a whole bunch of dogs and they did this experiment. And they put them all in their kennels. And in the kennels on the floor, they had they put in a little bit of electricity. on that floor. And you know how it feels when you're touching electricity? You know that feeling there? You know, and these dogs began to yelp, began to grumble, began to complain. And after some time, I mean, they were trying to get out of the situation. They were trying to jump out all the time, you know. And after some time, they got accustomed to it. And they actually increased the voltage. And the dog just sat there. They were calm as nothing is happening. Then what they did is, then they opened the doors of the kennels. And the dog just looked there like, no big deal. This is normal. And they tried different things with those dogs, and they weren't moving out. And finally, all these dogs were put in the same kennel there together. And they increased the electricity, and the dogs were laying around. And meanwhile, so what they did with a new experiment, they put all the dogs in this kennel together, and they put a new dog in there. And the moment they left the door open. And the moment they increased that electricity just a little bit, the new dog just took off. Says, goodbye, see you guys later. You know? And the other dogs, seeing the other dog take off, they all ran out too. Okay, this is no longer tolerable. Well, you know, your marriage can be that way. When people see that you're not tolerating the mundane, you're not tolerating the foolishness of what married life has become in society today, you can be an example to people to say, look, we don't want this. We want something better. And God has something vastly better for other people in this world, but people don't see it as much as they should. Do they see it in us as a church? You know, a lot of people have been hurt by bad relationships, broken relationships, selfishness, loneliness, and betrayal. And you too can be that example of that radiant experience that we can all have in serving the Lord. But remember, there's only one way to do it. I want you to remember this Bible verse for both of you in your relationship as you're beginning a new life together. Remember that all of this blissful thing begins with something special. And that is found in Matthew 11, 28 to 30. Jesus is talking to you today. And before you get busy with all the preparation activities, and tomorrow's going to be very busy, and Monday's very busy, and all this stuff. Today, sometimes it would be really nice for both of you to stop and think that Jesus says to you, come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. This is the wonderful blessing that God has for you. And may God bless you both as you begin your journey together. God bless you all. Thank you.
Amen.